All right, so chapter 10 is titled Photosynthesis. In this chapter, we get a chance to talk about this anabolic process which uses solar energy to convert simple molecules of carbon dioxide and water into energy-rich carbohydrates like glucose, for example. So on this particular slide, we've already seen the image that's depicted here. Right? We used this when we were introducing cellular respiration. And so if you'll remember, we have our ecosystem here, right, in that greenish color. We talked about how energy comes into the ecosystem, gets transformed within the ecosystem, and then will leave the ecosystem as heat energy. For cellular respiration, we looked at the bottom half of this cycle where cells will take organic molecules and in the presence of oxygen and through the use of the mitochondria, cells will convert the energy in the organic molecules to molecules of ATP, and then they'll return as products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water. In this particular chapter, when we're looking at photosynthesis, now we get a chance to look at the top half of this cycle. So again, we are going to be looking at how organisms will take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from, let's say, the soil pulled up by the roots, and then through the use of the chloroplasts within those photosynthetic cells, we have a chance to absorb that light energy and use that light energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into organic molecules, and then also release oxygen to the atmosphere. This process of photosynthesis will directly or sometimes indirectly nourish the entire living world. We all depend on it, whether we can do it ourselves, if you happen to be a plant, or even those of us that do not do photosynthesis, we depend on that process for our source, our food. So for example, any organism that can sustain itself without eating anything derived from other organisms is called an autotroph. These are considered the producers of our biosphere. And so they have the ability to make these organic molecules from carbon dioxide and other inorganic substances found in the surrounding environment. Plants are one example of autotrophs that are more specifically categorized into a different sort of subcompartment of autotrophs that are called photoautotrophs. So any organism that has the ability to use sunlight to make these organic molecules is considered a photoautotroph. Now, typically when we think of photosynthesis, we think of, using that light energy to convert to chemical energy, we immediately think plant. Right? But there are plenty of other photosynthetic organisms. So yes, there are plants. There are algae that can do photosynthesis. There are certain protists, so unicellular eukaryotes that can carry out photosynthesis. And then lastly, there are even some prokaryotic cells, some photosynthetic bacteria, for example, that can do this same energy conversion, taking that light energy and converting it into chemical energy. Now, we as animals, we are not autotrophs or photoautotrophs. We are what are called heterotrophs. So we obtain our organic material from other organisms. We are considered the consumers of the biosphere, right? So we will either directly depend on photosynthetic organisms for our energy. Let's say eating a salad, for example, right? You're directly consuming photosynthetic organisms to gain those sources of fuel. Or you might be a heterotroph if you don't like to eat the green stuff, right? You might depend on your food, like a cow, eating the green stuff. And then when the cow eats the grass, it will incorporate those energy-rich molecules into its body, and then when we eat the cow, when we have a tasty hamburger, right, we are then getting sort of indirectly those same sugar molecules as our source of fuel. Now, something very important to note is that almost all heterotrophs, so organisms that gain their organic material from other organisms, including humans, depend on photoautotrophs not just for food, right? But we also need the oxygen that those photosynthetic organisms produce. right? You need food. You also need to breathe. You need to breathe because you need that oxygen as the other reactant for cellular respiration so that your cells can make ATP. Without oxygen, you're going to die a lot quicker than you will without food. All right, so when we talk about photosynthesis, we have to discuss where photosynthesis occurs within a cell, within one of these photoautotrophs. So remember that the chloroplast is going to be the organelle that conducts photosynthesis. Chloroplasts, again, when we introduced them back in chapter 6, we talked about how we think that they came about as a result of this endosymbiont theory. We think that they were originally some sort of photosynthetic bacterium, perhaps, that was engulfed by a larger ancestor of a eukaryotic cell and kept as a pet, because, you know, what's better than having a pet that makes energy molecules for you? That's fantastic, and that's just happening with their exposure to sunlight or to solar energy. When we look at the chloroplast, we also have to think about, well, how is this organelle organized? And how does its organization, how does its structure make it really conducive to making the process of photosynthesis as efficient as possible? So let's sort of take a look one more time at the chloroplasts and where chloroplasts are located. So leaves are going to be the major locations of photosynthesis. It makes a lot of sense. They're like these little umbrella or antenna that are out there on the very topmost parts of plants, closest to the sun, readily available to absorb that light energy. Now, chloroplasts are going to be found mainly in cells that are part of the mesophyll tissue of the leaf. So this is an interior portion of the leaf. If you remember, we looked at different kinds of tissues back in chapter 1, and our example was a maple leaf, and we looked at a cross-section through the maple leaf, and you can see that there are 2 different kinds of tissues in that one maple leaf. So if you take a look at this cartoon diagram, this is a cross-section through one of these kinds of leaves here. And the intermediate portion here, those green cells, are going to be the mesophyll cells making up the mesophyll tissue. The other kinds of cells here that we have on the top and the bottom, those are going to form the epidermis, or the skin, the protective layer of the leaf. And you'll notice that they're gray. They don't have any chloroplasts, so they don't have the ability to perform photosynthesis. They're just there to protect those cells on the inside that do have that capability to do photosynthesis. One more thing to note on this slide. If you look at the undersides of leaves, and maybe you've seen this on an actual leaf as you've turned it over, some of them have really big, what are called stomata, which you could potentially see with your eyes, and others are microscopic. But these stomata are essentially pores on the undersides of leaves that allow the exchange of gases. Right, so carbon dioxide is going to be one of the reactants of photosynthesis. So you have to get that carbon dioxide into the inside of that mesophyll tissue. And then oxygen is one of the products of photosynthesis. So plants have to release that back into the atmosphere. So you have to have this nice exchange of gases into and out of the leaf. Now the trouble is that most leaves, the epidermis is a little waxy, right? This is to protect the leaf, to prevent loss of water, things like that. And so it's hard to get oxygen and carbon dioxide to move across that epidermal tissue on the leaf. And so the leaves have these pores, these what are called stomata on the underside of the leaves to help with that gas exchange. And the cool thing about the stomata is depending on what the leaf needs, the stomata can either open or close. So they're regulatory mechanisms as well. All right, and so now as we look specifically at the chloroplasts inside of these mesophyll cells, remember, a mesophyll cell can have anywhere maybe from 20 to 40 chloroplasts on the inside, depending on what kind of cell you're looking at, or what kind of plant you're looking at. If you'll recall from chapter 6, we talked about how the chloroplast has 2 membranes, just like the mitochondria. That's one of those pieces of evidence that lead us to believe in the endosymbiont theory. The 2 membranes in the chloroplast, however, are completely smooth, right? So you can see them right here, the outer membrane and then the inner membrane here on the inside. They're nice and smooth. On the inside of the inner membrane is a fluid. This fluid is called the stroma. It's very dense. It has a lot of materials dissolved in it, so it's fairly thick. Don't confuse the stroma with the stomata, right? Stroma is the fluid in the chloroplast, whereas the stomata are those pores on the undersides of leaves that help with gas exchange. Now, in the stroma, or surrounded by the stroma, are the thylakoids. This is technically that third set of membranes that are found in the chloroplast. The thylakoid membrane is going to be stacked into what I like to call little poker chips, right? So you can see them here. And the stacks of these thylakoids are called grana or granum. If you're talking about a singular stack, if you're talking about multiple stacks, they will be called grana. And specifically, these thylakoid membranes are shown in green because this is where the pigment chlorophyll resides. Well, chlorophyll is actually embedded in the thylakoid membrane, and the chlorophyll, not only does it allow the chloroplasts in the cells and the leaves to appear green, but it is also one of the main pigment molecules which allows the absorbance of light energy. All right, and so you can see here the other sort of parts of the chloroplast. Inside the stroma, remember that's where you're going to have your DNA, your ribosomes floating around as well. And then inside of each thylakoid, you have the thylakoid space. That's going to be important as we start talking about the inside or the internal workings of photosynthesis. All right, so to introduce some background on the process of photosynthesis. Just like cellular respiration, it's a very complicated series of chemical reactions, but we can take all those chemical reactions and summarize them as if they took place as one single chemical reaction. We have that summarized chemical reaction here. All right, so we've got 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 12 water molecules, and light energy. Those are going to be things that are used within the chemical reaction, and the products produced are going to be complex organic molecules like glucose, for example, 6 molecules of oxygen, 6 molecules of water. So not only do plants use water, but they actually also produce water as a result of photosynthesis. Now, hopefully you've noticed that this particular chemical reaction is a little bit more complicated than the one for cellular respiration. So let me show you how to normalize it a little bit, right? What we can do is, because we've got water on both sides, both on the reactant side and the product side, we could take away, right? Lowest common denominator, take away 6 water molecules from both sides. So that would leave us with 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules on the reactant side, and then simply just sugar and oxygen on the product side. And that literally is the reverse of cellular respiration, right? In cellular respiration, we use glucose plus oxygen. We release energy in the form of heat and to make ATP, and we make 6 molecules of water, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So again, if you know one of the 2 chemical reactions, you know them both. Just know which one goes where. The easiest way for me to remember is I think about myself as a human. What do I use and what do I produce, right? So I take oxygen in and I use it as a reactant for cellular respiration, and then I exhale carbon dioxide as a product of cellular respiration. So that helps me remember what's on which side. I take food in, right, and I give back waste. All right, so again, photosynthesis is simply the reverse of cellular respiration, not just in the chemical reaction as it's shown on this slide, but also in the flow of energy and the flow of electrons through the process. So let's take one step back and just briefly go through cellular respiration again, right? In cellular respiration, we take a high energy glucose molecule, right? We take the electrons from the glucose, we squeeze energy out of them, and once the electrons are devoid of their energy because we used it to make ATP, they end up with oxygen to make water. So we go from glucose to water for the electrons. In photosynthesis, it's the direct opposite. Plants get their electrons from water, give them a boost in energy, and then pack them back in to organic molecules like glucose. So it's still a redox process, it's just you're going in the opposite direction. All right, and then lastly, photosynthesis is an endergonic process, right? And the energy boost that's required is provided by light.